Yes.
few years.
Hello all, we can get going again. I know I introduced myself this morning. I'm Anne Marie Slaughter, for those of you who have come in since this morning. I just wanted to add that this entire colloquium is being webcast. That is what the camera there is for, and that is one reason we want you to speak into the microphone when you ask questions, because even if the people in this room can hear you, it is harder for the webcast. We are also blogging this event on PolicyNet, which is our new virtual community of public policy schools around the world. And this for the social networks of the future, maybe mobilizing people to action, we will be bringing in the virtual world. So I wanted to tell you all that, and then to turn to Paul Raushenbush, our co-sponsor from the Office of Religious Life.
Well, thank you, Dean Slaughter, for this remarkable colloquium. I'm so pleased to be a part of it. I think it's so much about what the work I want to be doing, and I am so impressed and honored to be a part of this. And I want to say on behalf of my colleagues at the Office of Religious Life, Deborah Blanks, and all of our office, we're so glad to be sponsors here of this event. Before I introduce our panel, and in light of the focus of this colloquium, which is bringing what moves people to action, from passion to politics, I want to start with a familiar parable from the Christian scriptures. You didn't know we were going to have a little church in here, but you wouldn't mind given the title. We'll keep it welcoming and open. But this is from Luke 10, 25 to 37, and it is a very familiar parable, but I'm going to read it just so that everybody in the room has a sense of context. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan, which goes, just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, who beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And so likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, and he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved by pity, and went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now, this parable by Jesus articulates the demands of God upon believers. Love your neighbor as yourself, and provides entry into some of the questions that will be raised throughout this colloquium. The first is stated explicitly: who is my neighbor? How do we know and how will we prioritize who we view as our neighbor? What sort of concentric circles will we use? Will it be our friends? Will it be our family, our community, those who we identify with, our nation? How will we know who is deserving of our neighbor, and how shall we prioritize our resources? Is it always necessary to have a face-to-face encounter with someone who you are going to call your neighbor? Do you have to personally encounter them like the Samaritan did on the road? Or can you, with a click of a mouse, read and see the horrors across the ocean and know that it is happening and be moved to action there? Who is my neighbor? The second question the parable raises is a little bit more difficult to pin down. What was it that moved the person to pity? The other two who passed by had perfectly legitimate and practical reasons why they could not help. What was it that moved this person to pity? We know it was something, but what was that thing? And if Professor Putnam mentioned this morning, maybe it was the Samaritan community had been preaching about that a lot. And so that was the influence that somehow influenced his decision. But when we think about this, what moves people to action, it is that very moment there. What moves people to pity? And the final question I will pose in the context of a school devoted to policy is, while it's inspiring to hear of one example of someone coming to the aid of a victim of abuse, a victim of a robbery, if we have continuous assaults on the road to Jericho, at what point does pity and mercy move us to actually stopping the attacks, as opposed to doing the cleanup work of continuous attack? And so at what point does this bring us to policy, from passion to policy? The good news is I have three people here who will answer these questions once and for all. This is what I have bragged as my dream panel. I am so pleased to welcome you three here. It's such an honor to have you at Princeton. I'm going to introduce each of you in the order in which you'll speak, and then we'll just proceed with each of you in a row. We start with Professor Alan Hertzke, who is the Director of Religious Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Alan is an internationally recognized expert on religion and politics. He is the author of Representing God in Washington, an award-winning analysis of religious lobbies, of Echoes of Dissent, an account of church-rooted populist movements, and the co-author of Religion and Politics in America. His latest book is titled Freeing God's Children, The Unlikely Alliance for Global Human Rights. Next, we have Dr. E. Ann Peterson, M.D., Senior International Health Advisor at World Vision International. Ann is a public health physician and a former missionary whose career has spanned direct program implementation in Africa, to epidemiology and education material design, to governmental administration and policy development. She was a presidential appointee to USAID and holds extensive international and domestic health experience with program management for 30-plus countries in AIDS, infectious diseases, child survival, and family planning. She is the author of many papers and articles, but my personal favorite is a chapter in a book called The Hope Factor, Engaging the Church in the HIV/AIDS Crisis. Dr. Peterson's piece was called From Missionary Doctor to Policy Maker, How One Christian Confronts AIDS. Finally, we have Reverend Richard Cizik, who is the Vice President for Governmental Affairs at the National Association of Evangelicals, where his primary responsibilities include setting the NAE's policy directions on issues before Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court, as well as serving as a national spokesman on issues of concern. Reverend Cizik has been involved in international religious liberty causes for the association since 1980, when he urged policymakers to add religion to the annual Human Rights Report. Since 2003, Reverend Cizik has been active in the Christian environmentalist movement called Creation Care, which finds inspiration for stewardship of the earth within the Bible. In 2004, the Board of Directors of the National Association of Evangelicals unanimously voted to adopt a historic document on public engagement called For the Health of the Nations, an evangelical call to civic responsibility, which included the call to care for the environment. I welcome all three of you here And I encourage you all to join me in welcoming to this wonderful panel, The Demands of God.
Well, first, let me express my profound thanks to Dean Slaughter, to Dean Raushenbush, and to the folks here at the Woodrow Wilson School and the Center for Religious Life. Particularly, I want to express my appreciation for this trenchant theme, which has really provoked me in thinking more clearly about what motivated the people I study, and the provocative question that Paul issued to us, what motivated us to get involved, something I haven't thought about very clearly and had to think about a little bit more. Beginning in the mid-1990s, a new movement burst onto the international stage. Galvanized initially by concern about the persecution of Christians around the world, the movement expanded to encompass a wider quest to promote human rights through the machinery of American foreign policy. This movement of unlikely allies passed a succession of legislative acts that I argue has created a new architecture for human rights advocacy in American foreign policy. These acts include the International Religious Freedom Act, that in fact Rich Cizik had a lot to do with, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the Sudan Peace Act of 2002, and the North Korean Human Rights Act of 2004. Central to this movement are evangelicals, heretofore associated with domestic skirmishes and the culture wars, but increasingly engaged in international advocacy on human rights and humanitarian issues. In fact, evangelicals provided the grassroots muscle for causes that were engaged by a wide array of advocates. And indeed, the thing that struck me as I studied this movement and immersed myself in it was the extent to which conservative evangelicals, not only conservative ones, but moderates and liberals as well, but particularly conservative evangelicals, were working with Jews, Catholics, Episcopalians, Tibetan Buddhists, Iranian Baha'is, labor unions, the Congressional Black Caucus, and feminist groups. And yes, during the trafficking, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, literally, or maybe metaphorically, I should put it, people like Charles Colson and Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention walked hand in hand with Gloria Steinem and a number of other feminist leaders. It was a remarkable and striking coalition. So what moved them to action? What has moved this large religious community to action? That's a profound question. And I'm going to suggest 4 factors, briefly, that I think help contribute to this action on the part of evangelicals. The first is the rise of global Christianity. In 1900, the vast majority of the world's Christians lived in North America and Greater Europe, including Russia. By the year 2000, at least 2/3 of the world's Christians now live in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Literally, a tectonic shift has occurred in the global Christian population, a shift of the Christian church to the global south. To give you a sense of this, over half of sub-Saharan Africa now is Christian in population. There are more Christians probably who worship in China than in all of Western Europe. There are more Anglicans who worship in any of a number of African countries than in all of North America and England, the birthplace of the Anglican Church. What this means is that the Christian church is in some sense nested increasingly amidst poverty and exploitation and violence and war and persecution. It is, in a sense, increasingly a suffering church, a metaphor that you will hear often in evangelical circles. And in particular, why this is so important is that American evangelicals very much identify with this suffering church, their fellow brothers and sisters around the world. because they see how these believers live what Bonhoeffer called the high cost of discipleship. Now, the second factor is communications and travel, or the advent of global communication and travel, which has created a heightened awareness among American Christians of the suffering around the world. And more important, as Bob Putnam said this morning, heightened personal connections to people who are suffering or who are enduring the high cost of discipleship. Increasingly at Christian conferences, you will see not American Christian leaders speaking, but foreign Christian leaders who are treated as heroes and role models of the faithful. And another interesting phenomenon with respect to travel is that an increasing phenomenon in evangelical circles, and not exclusively so, but especially so, are mission trips. And these are often of several weeks to a month or longer, often self-financed, often by college students and other young people. And something like 1.5 million Americans have gone on a mission trip to Latin America, Asia, or Africa. Maybe 100,000 a year. And they don't go in the mode that we tend to think that historically of the white missionary preaching to non-Christian peoples. They generally go to places where they are nested in Christian communities who are happening to suffer. They work with AIDS orphans, or they work on building wells, and so forth. They get a personal connection to suffering people. And the advent of communication means that they can continue to keep that relationship alive after they've left. I know a woman in Midland, Texas, calls herself a rancher's daughter. A woman from Midland, Texas, whose home church, she says, is a congregation in southern Sudan, and who maintains email communication with the Council of Churches in southern Sudan, and who in fact was a citizen negotiator of the Sudan Peace Act, of the Sudan peace process. The third factor are the rich social networks that I don't have to elaborate on because Bob Putnam talked about them this morning. The evangelical world is an entrepreneurial world, and born to a certain extent of discontent with the drift of secular change in the United States, a number of entrepreneurs over the last quarter century have built what Bob Putnam himself has called the richest social movement networks in America. These provide venues for people to interact, for people to ask for participation, to invite their friends to get involved. So that these rich social movement networks, born to a certain extent of conservative impulses, have been put in service of international human rights and humanitarian concerns. As Samantha Power wrote recently, some of the most active people involved in the Darfur cause are Jews and evangelicals. Finally, the final factor that I think brought evangelicals into active engagement, mobilization for this movement for human rights is focus. If you study social movements, you realize that at some point in social movement history, there has to be some kind of a legislative campaign, state legislative, local, or national, congressional. Because legislative campaigns provide a focus, the drama of a legislative lobby battle, a focus for mobilization, for initiative, for effort, a sense of creating excitement about the cause. And if there is success on one piece of legislation, as there was on the International Religious Freedom Act, which passed unanimously on the last day of the Congress in 1998, that propels then people who feel a greater sense of confidence and efficacy to move toward other issues. Now, these are the factors, as an analyst and as a scholar, I've attempted to understand the movement that I write about. But in some ways, they really don't capture fully the movement that has taken place and that continues to this day. And so I've taken Paul's challenge to heart, and I've asked myself, what got me involved? Why did I get involved? I didn't need to write the book for tenure. I already had that. It's hard work. It was the hardest work I've ever done in my life, trying to sort of capture a multifaceted, complex movement over a period of 6 or 7 years. It was an enormous enterprise, which my wife was gladly done with when it was over. So to give you a sense of my own motivation, let me introduce you to some of the people that I've got to meet and know over the last few years. I'd like to get, in a sense, get you to know some of these people. Gatana, Matafraya Gatana, from Ethiopia, was a local pastor who during the Mengistu regime was arrested for preaching, was tortured, denied food and water for days, beaten regularly, ultimately escaped from prison and made his way to the United States, where he today is a very popular evangelist. Or Francis Bach, a young 20-year-old Dinka man who, with the characteristic slimness of his Dinka tribe in southern Sudan, is very tall, and you look up at him, and he looks down at you, and he speaks in biblical cadences because for a decade, for 10 years, he was a slave, a literal slave in southern Sudan, and speaks to audiences who weep, Jewish audiences, black churches, other congregations, when he says, I come here to speak on behalf of my people to help set them free. Or Oswaldo Madrigal, and I understand why, given that name, he is known universally as Pastor Wally, who is a Filipino. Pastor Wally was preaching to a group of Filipino workers in Saudi Arabia and was arrested for violating the law, was tortured, imprisoned, and ultimately given a death sentence. Only international pressure resulted in his release and expulsion from that country. Or take Noble Alexander, who spent years in Castro's jails in Cuba, and who surreptitiously preached the gospel in all kinds of creative ways. And whenever he was found out to be preaching the gospel, he was that certain suffering was meted out to him. And at one point he describes, and you can imagine how a rapt audience would take this, he describes how he was placed in a pit of sewage all night in the cold, forced to stand there. And he describes how, toward the morning, a blossom emerged from the muck, and the fragrance of the blossom overwhelmed the stench, which he took as a sign of God's grace on his work. Or take Lee Sun-ok of North Korea. She was a low-level party functionary in that North Korean regime, the Orwellian regime of North Korea. But some minor infraction sent her into one of the many gulags of that regime. And she was struck by something that she saw, which was that the regime singled out Christians for special punishment. If someone was found out to be a Christian, not only they, but their whole family was often tortured and killed, often publicly in the camps. And what struck her is the gentleness and the goodness of these people as they often went to their death singing hymns. Or finally, a young woman I got to meet when I was lecturing in China some years ago, I call St. Joan of Xi'an. It's very common for Chinese college students to take on a Western name to help us Westerners. And she called herself Joan. And after a lecture I gave, she was a college student at one of the top universities in China, a place like Princeton, very elite, poised, brilliant, articulate, fluent English, a political science major. And as a political scientist, what more could you ask for? And I was just touched by this young woman. And she said to me after the lecture one-on-one quietly, well, I belong to a fellowship, which in China means I belong to an unregistered underground church, which is against the law. And she said to me, you know, I'm a political science major, and I'd love to go into government service. And certainly with her degree and her background, the world would have been open up to her. But she said, in order to do so, I have to join the Communist Party, and I have to profess atheism. And she said, and I can't do that. And I was sort of stunned by that commitment, a young woman making a life-changing decision. When you meet these people, there's nothing bitter about them. They're buoyant, they're happy, they're upbeat. And in some ways so inspiring that they lead you, if you're a believer, to question your own faith. There is a famous saying, especially prevalent in evangelical circles, it goes something like this. If you were charged with being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict? These people have literally been convicted of being Christians. And they inspired me. And in some sense, to use evangelical argot, they convicted me. And I felt the least I could do was tell their story. And in a curious sort of way, they made me, Catholic, more devout, more religious. But there's more. There's more. As I studied this movement for human rights, the intersection of international sufferers and activists and American activists and congressional leaders and so forth, I found myself, as I immersed myself in this movement, surrounded by activists who had made the movement from awareness to action, who were determined, committed, in it for the long haul. And I was so struck by their dedication, by the fact that they would not let setbacks get to them, that they were in it for years. And I know that probably something in my own moral formation, perhaps the story of the Good Samaritan, made me immediately link mentally with this movement. I identified with it. I cared about the same issues. And I began to write op-ed pieces. And I began to go to insider meetings, and I would sometimes speak and offer advice. In a sense, to put it in social science terms, I was allowing myself to become an independent variable in the movement I was studying. I joined the movement that I was studying, that I wrote about. And that changed me. And it also increased my own sense of conviction that I have to do more, that I have to stay in it for the long haul, that I have to care about Darfur and about trafficking and about AIDS. Well, let me conclude with a profile of one of these activists that I think helps vividly describe both the impact of events and formative experiences on some of the evangelical leaders who've gotten involved, but also why they are so powerful, why they are such powerful witnesses. So let me introduce you to one of the activists now, a man named Gary Haugen, an evangelical Christian. He went to that other university called Harvard, and then got a law degree at Chicago, no slouch, and then joined the Justice Department. And during the Clinton administration, he was detailed to be the chief UN investigator for the Rwanda War Crimes Tribunal. And Haugen describes how he was absolutely riveted by the experience of going through records, literally going through mass graves, and realizing that he as an evangelical hadn't connected with the justice tradition in his own faith. And so he formed the International Justice Mission to fight on behalf of widows denied their inheritance, children who were trafficked, people who are in bonded labor, and so forth, to fight on behalf of justice. And he had heard, through Christian missionaries, of a notorious village outside of Phnom Penh in Cambodia called Svay Pak, a village devoted entirely to trafficking in young children for sexual purposes, for sex tourism, run by traffickers and pimps, protected by corrupt police. The entire village was known by everyone in Phnom Penh as a place where, if you're a sex tourist, you could go and have a 6-year-old girl if you wanted one. And so he sent an undercover agent for International Justice Mission to go there with a camera, and he filmed one of these transactions of a young girl, 6 years old, being sold for sex. And Haugen took that video and he showed it to Cambodian authorities, and they did nothing. He showed it to State Department officials, and they raised some concern. He showed it to members of Congress, and he testified before Congress, and ultimately helped to get the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But he did more. He kept pressing the case, and finally, armed with the new legislation and a State Department official who was tough enough to threaten the Cambodian government with a loss of American aid if it did not crack down on its sex tourism industry in children, a raid was organized. And Haugen literally went in with local police, raided the village, captured the perpetrators, and freed some 40 girls and a few boys who were held captive. On his desk, and the cover of my book is a broken padlock, on his desk is a busted padlock that he used with bolt cutters to cut open one of the rooms where the girls were locked up. And one of the girls was literally the girl who was being sold for sex, named Lana. And he tells the story of, and her photograph, in fact, in the place, let's put it this way, the story is told and is depicted vividly. In the place of the grainy, sickening photograph of her being sold for sex, there are now photographs on the International Justice Mission website of a smiling Lana, soda can in hand, at a party. And what I like to say, and what I do say in the conclusion of my book, is that because of people like Gary Haugen and the other activists who fought against trafficking, because of the faith-based movement, Lana, a child of God, has been set free. Thank you.
Can I get this turned on? If I could get the PowerPoint, thank you very much. I just want to also say thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have, in the last year, been thinking very hard about my life as a public health physician and how do I express the wholeness of physical health together with spiritual health. I spend most of my time talking data, programs, policies, and then on to what can we do about it, where can we move forward on things. But I think you've heard today what I think will be the theme of what I want to talk about, and that is when we talk about what brings us to dealing with these issues across the world, it is personal relationships. It's a personal relationship with God, and it is a personal relationship with the people that we are trying to serve. And tell me what I need to do. I don't see a mouse. There we go. There. Thank you. See if I can get it on here. There we go. There we go. Perfect. So what is our calling? My daughter recently graduated from William and Mary, another one of those other schools, and had Archbishop Desmond Tutu come and talk about South Africa and the justice issues and the call to action there. God gives us a compassion for hurting. We have lots and lots of scriptural verses that call us to, and require, admonish us when we don't, to care for the hurting world. James 1:22, religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit widows and orphans and in their affliction. The whole Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. Micah, we've been talking about justice. He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Teddy Roosevelt said the same thing. Do justice, and therefore fight valiantly against those who are reigning to do evil in the world. Care for the little children. We have a long historical heritage, both of faith, but also in our politics and our government, for working in justice. And why? Here's my data. The poor are many, and they are hidden from our everyday life. The children of the world are still dying. This is my hot issue. 10.5 million children under the age of 5 die every year, and nobody says anything. A tsunami happens and a few 100,000 people die, and the world rallies, sees it, hears, responds, and we have 10.5 million small children dying every year. There are people who go to bed hungry every day, and there are people who go to bed hungry for 3 or 4 months out of the year. I was in medical school when I became a Christian, and I thought, oh my goodness, I had never anticipated this. I came from a very clinical, atheistic environment. Suddenly, I'm a new Christian. It's, what in the world does God want me to do, and how do I know what His call is on my life? And I went on one of those short-term missions and worked in a mission hospital. And we did clinical care, and I saw lots of little children come in, go out, come back in, get sick. We did wonderful things. We made a difference. We saw all kinds of exotic diseases, from plague to elephantiasis to complications of measles. We then went out into the community, and I met this little child, probably about 1.5 years old, the size of a 8 or 9 month old, with the red hair of malnutrition, with an enlarged spleen from chronic malaria, polio paralysis in both legs, and infected oozing scabies up and down all limbs. And I looked at this child and I thought, in my clinic, in that hospital, we could do almost nothing about these problems. They're already there, they're done. But every single one of them could have been prevented. And for me, this sent me on a life-changing journey to prevention, to work in communities, to make a difference in the people's lives, choices, and hopes in the places where they lived. And I've worked in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Brazil, doing safe drinking water with nomadic tribes, working with village health workers, and a call to action. One of the most fascinating things is to see mothers who have been hopeless in watching their children get sick and die learn that there are things they can do to keep their children healthy, that their lives and their hopes for their family and their children is transformed. And of the community health workers, the women who were taught and trained, it was, frankly, the Christians who did it, not just the first year, the second year, the 5th year, but the 15th year and the 20th year. So I recently went back to Kenya, where we did our original community development work, and those Christian community health workers that worked with us in the Anglican Church are still caring for their neighbors, teaching them how they can keep their children healthy. I worked a long time in HIV/AIDS, and sometimes it's data that calls us to action. I saw my first AIDS patient that year I was in Zaire. I saw my second AIDS patient that same summer, a couple months later, in Long Island, New York. And it was compelling for me that there was this global problem that at that time had no voice nobody speaking for it. And it has since grown. In a place when I lived in Kenya with less than 1%, it got to over 20%. When I lived in Zimbabwe, the HIV prevalence was 30% of the adult population were infected, and there are countries that are higher than that. And we know that it's finally beginning to turn around, and I just thank God for that. But what we don't often realize is that as the AIDS epidemic has been a wave attacking the world, and the adults begin to get sick and die, we are still to face the wave of orphans and vulnerable children who are coming to us. And those are exactly the same children who will be the poorest, the most at risk, without families, without food, without hope, and most at risk of, again, dying of the same things they have died of forever and ever. We worked in schools, and this is one of my favorite teaching posters that we did in our AIDS prevention work. And if you show this in America, sometimes people get what this story is. You put this up in an African village, an African school, and it doesn't even take a blink of an eye. This is a sugar daddy, an authority figure, a principal, a teacher who's soliciting a favor from the young schoolgirl. She can't say no. And one of the most astounding and profound changes that I saw happen was when we put this up and we tried to do some of the problem solving and then said, what can this girl do? Is there anything she can do? And we talk about it with the girls. How can you stay safe? Who can you go to? But even more so, when I turn to the boys in the room and say, if that was your sister or girlfriend, what's your responsibility to take action? Should you be doing something? And not all of them, but some of them, the light would come on in their eyes. Yes, I have some responsibility then. And then the question, are you going to be that sugar daddy when you grow up? When you attain all the wonderful things you want to attain, are you going to do this to young girls and put them at risk? And again, the light bulb going on in some of their eyes. That's a call to action. That's a call to change that can begin to transform our world. Well, I was really happy being a missionary in Africa. This was just wonderful, profound. I had an immediate response and interaction with the people on the ground, in the field, the kids in schools. This is where my heart is. And then out of the blue, I get this call, and a persistent call. Please, 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 would you come? And what they wanted to do was for me to take a political post with the state of Virginia, be in charge of the state health program. And I thought, oh my goodness, no. And in fact, when we'd previously been in Kenya, I had said to my husband, he was contemplating trying to get involved in international health politics and making a difference because he was displeased with where we were. I said, no, don't make me a politician's wife. And then 15 years later, here I am with this persistent call that I could make a difference in the domestic health arena. I went to Virginia. I found that, in fact, you can take the passion for international health and look at what's happening here in the domestic arena, which is very cross-cultural, and work on policy in politics and truly make a difference that is worthwhile. But it was also, for me, a training ground that I never expected to have for my next post, which was to go to the U.S. Agency for International Development, where now I was in charge of our foreign aid programs for 100 countries, doing family planning, AIDS prevention, all that lovely ABC stuff, child survival, maternal mortality, and I was immediately thrust into the mix of things I knew very well. How do you make programs work on the ground to save the lives of mothers and children, but also in the middle of political controversies where sometimes the data and the rights and wrongs of things are very hard to get addressed fairly and honestly. But you have a voice. You get to speak in global policy dialogues and to try and lead the way forward in ways that haven't been before. So that in the UN, when we talked about how do we get enough people on the ground to work, we could talk about what was actually happening in the ground. I could speak from my years on the ground in the field and try and make a difference. To go to places like Afghanistan, torn by war and conflict and hopelessness, and see a health program that had brought training of midwives to a small community. And when I met with the men, I'm the only woman in a room of Muslim elders, and they are saying to me, because of the peace and this program and this U.S. government program has brought hope to our children. Our women no longer die in childbirth. Our children are going up, and this is part of the peace dividend. We are going to fight for peace in Afghanistan and keep the peace because this is what we want for our children. An incredible reaffirmation of the difference we could make. And then there's how do we live as Christians and be leaders in policy and politics? This is one of my heroes. And as you've heard, a lot of the heroes now are those Christians working in hard places, the suffering church. When we were in Kenya, I was seconded to the Anglican Church, and this is a young bishop who was incredibly innovative. He was the first church, first any program in Kenya to address HIV/AIDS. He was also willing to stand up and say, governments should not steal, torture, or kill their people. And he used to regularly get in trouble with the Kenyan government at that time, and found himself eventually being the lone voice for justice within Kenya. And we were the only expatriates, whites, working with him. There was a day I thought we were going to get kicked out of the country just because we worked with this man. They tried to bribe him, they tried to harass him, they put his staff in jail, and eventually they killed him. And he has been, for me, a model of integrity. When you are brought to the place of, is your faith real? Will you hold by what is right and wrong, whether it's a little thing or whether it is a really big thing? Will we stay true to the calling that we have? And he was one all the way to death. So what is our faith? And how do we live it out? For me, it's the children, whether it's in India or Africa, whether it's reaching out in a specific program or answering the smile of a child, reaching out with new partners. I went actually to Banda Aceh in the tsunami with the Department of Defense. I had never worked with the military before. How and when do you work with new partners, new ways, and move forward to address destruction? And one of the take-home lessons for me is that the resilience of children is incredibly unbelievable, that they will bounce back through very, very hard circumstances. And this is the reason we do what we are doing, reaching out to orphans and widows. I worked with street children in Harare, and I'd sit down to try and teach them, how do you stay healthy when you live on the streets? And I would have 6-year-olds come and sit on my lap just wanting someone to hold on to them. And there is no child in sub-Saharan Africa that is not affected by HIV/AIDS. If they are in the schools and their parents are healthy, their biggest fear is that they may be the next one to be orphaned. They all know somebody somewhere. But there's an additional calling. Again, Scripture commands us, maybe even demands us, that if we know what's right to do and we don't do it, it is sin. And it brings me back to this child. I worked in AIDS for ages, but this issue of the children who are still dying doesn't have a voice. AIDS now has a global voice, but there isn't anyone speaking for the children. And so I left the U.S. government, not having managed to transform and get that issue back on the table. And I've now moved back into the faith-based world, and I'm working with World Vision, the largest NGO in the world. We're working in lots of different countries, and it has, you can see the little concentric circles. a core mandate to be distinctly Christian, to be community-based, and to make sure that everything they do has impact on the lives of children. In all different countries, this is in India, in the polio eradication, and what was important to me in the work I've just done is the heart to change and the heart to bring change to communities. We have, as our teammates, the local communities. The man on the right is a Pokot elder, completely traditional, used to live in a world where disease and death was the norm. And coming and walking alongside him, he begins to see that there are things in his control that he can do, and leads his community in transformation and in hope. But how do you do that? It's very easy when we're U.S. government, or I'm World Vision, great big organization, or I'm a doctor coming into an illiterate community, to be the great big expert in the discussion, when in fact we have a little bit of expertise. They have a whole lot of expertise on their situation, their place, and what they can do. And one of the uniquely, I think, Christian things that we bring to the table is the recognition that everyone is special in God's sight, and that it is the communication, the space for dialogue between people that truly gives the place for radical change and radical action to happen. I will tell you, though, that the call to action and transformation isn't alone sufficient, because it's hard work doing this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. There are a lot of things that make you weary as you go on, from politics to corruption to the slowness of change. What do we do to overcome that weariness? That's as important as the initial call. This morning you heard about social networks and supporting one another. That is one of the key things that make a difference. Both Scripture, I will tell you, at days that I thought I was just going to quit the job, I would get an email from someone saying, I am so thankful that you are there in the midst of what you are doing. I will say that being in the middle of the U.S. government was harder mission field for me than being in Africa, a harder call of action to stay in. And what's important is to refresh your soul. And this is how I refresh my soul. To go back out to the field, to hold the children that we are called to serve. This is an AIDS orphanage in India. Every single one of those little girls have been through exactly the kind of story you've just heard about. One little 6-year-old had been brought in 2 years earlier with 5 different sexually transmitted diseases from having lived and been sold on the street since she was 2 years old. This is in South Sudan, in a place right before they signed the peace accord, and the little children who now have a future and a hope. Important to remember is, this is my life verse, that we aren't called to do all the work in the world, but only the work that we are given to do. And that's how I think we get to not being weary in the well-doing. So God has a sense of humor. I never could have expected that my life would be what it was, or that it would grow and go the directions that it has gone. You need to follow your heart, know your strengths, be ready to be used even in the things you don't think you're very good at. I can remember, I will fess up at this, I had someone very early in my career say, Ann, you need to go into public speaking. And I about died. The first time I had to go in and see a patient, I paced outside the patient's room for an hour and a half before I could get myself to go in and talk to somebody one-on-one. And now God has me speaking in front of audiences. I could never, ever have expected that I could be used in that way. So God does call us to action. His call is compelling, and I think it demands a response. What is God calling you to do? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne Marie. Thank you, Alan Hertzke. My name is Rich Cizik, and I want to be sure that we have some time to talk about the issues that have been raised here today. And so I'll be brief, but I would like to be at least slightly innovative in the sense that when you ought to be able to leave with at least one great story, not a story of faith, but of humor. And around the world, I've told it to Ahmadinejad's Ayatollahs, his closest advisors. I told it to rabbis in Israel. I told it to evangelical Christians. It goes like this. I don't know if you've heard this story, Paul, but it goes like this. An American evangelical is going in his Jeep Cherokee over the hills and dales. He hits his brakes. He walks out and says to the shepherd who's quietly tending his sheep in a quiet summer blue day, just like today, he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" The shepherd's totally dumbstruck. He says, "Well, I guess so." Well, the American evangelical goes back into his Jeep Cherokee, gets on his laptop, goes to GPS. I call that God's positioning satellite. And within a moment or so, he has a stream of paper like my little notes here on napkins. And he walks up to the shepherd and he says, "Sir," he says, "you have 1,638 sheep." And the shepherd is totally dumbstruck. He says, "That's amazing. Go pick one out." So the American evangelical goes and picks one out, puts it in, carries it, puts him in his Jeep Cherokee and is driving away when the shepherd knocks on his window and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back?" And the American says, "Well, I guess so." So the shepherd says, "It's very simple." He says, "You are a consultant." And the American says, "How did you know?" He says, "It's very simple. You came into my world, you answered questions I have not asked, leave out, charge me a lot of money. And besides," he says, "diddly, you don't know diddly squat." He says, "You took my sheepdog." Now, we are all a bit the consultants. Anne is a consultant. Alan is an intellectual consultant. I am a political consultant. In effect, 27 years in Washington, D.C. for the National Association of Evangelicals. I would like to tell you that what you say to young people, people my age and those who are my seniors, when it comes to what, if this is the question, what moves people to action? What moves people to action? I can tell you today what I tell them. I tell them three things, and I use three examples. That's pretty simple. It's what a preacher does. He uses a three-point outline. But it goes like this. You, first of all, if you want to move people to action, you have to, one, cast the vision. Number two, you have to give them a strategy. And number three, you give them tactics that work. I would like to substitute not just the first issue of international human rights, not just the second issue which Anne has spoken to, that of HIV, AIDS, and child hunger, nutrition, and the rest around the world, but the biggest, most advantageous movement that evangelicals have ever engaged in American political history. I don't believe that is solipsistic. Tell me if you think so. I can take criticism. I've gotten a lot of it lately. In fact, people want to take my job away from me. But I believe that the issue of climate change, I'll substitute this little outline into that issue, is the issue which will be, as a gateway issue, you see, as an entryway point, as a defining measure of who we are as a people, an opportunity for the evangelicals, yes, to be everything that they ought to be. And there is occurring a great debate within American evangelicalism today. It is about how broad the agenda should be, what are the issues, who speaks for evangelicals, and how do we do this thing called politics, namely challenging 100 million people, according to the Baylor survey that's out this past fall. 100 million Americans attend an evangelical church on a weekly basis. What are the tactics? How do you actually engage them on all of the aforementioned issues in a way that is, I think, gospel-oriented and in the long run going to be effective? That is what we have as a movement going on in our midst, in our churches, in prayer groups, and you see it even on the blogs that have gone crazy in the last few months over this very issue of how do we do this. I say, first of all, to young people and others, indeed even the board of the NAE, you have to cast the vision. What is different? In a nutshell, when the evangelicals adopted the document Alan Hertzke referred to in 2004 called For the Health of the Nation, Evangelical Call to Civic Responsibility, we were departing from anything in the past because we were saying all of these issues are important, from, yes, international religious liberty, creation, care, compassion for the poor, human rights, and everything in between. All of the issues matter is what we are saying. That is what we are casting as a vision. And immediately we got reaction. Cal Thomas, a friend of mine, he still is a friend of mine, he wrote in the Washington Post, it was the Washington Times, he said, I'll pause there, draw your own conclusions. He wrote, this is unworthy, Richard. He's right. Nowhere in the Bible, quote, nowhere in the Bible does it say that we can, will, or should be able to influence this world prior to the return of the one Jesus to whom we owe absolute allegiance. And he said the reason we don't need to do this, and it's unworthy of our time, and nowhere in the Bible says we're going to make these changes, he says, is because our only task is Matthew 28:18. And I called him up and I said, Cal, whatever happened to the second part? He said, what second part? I said, the part that says where Jesus said, after you go and make disciples of all nations, that you teach them and to obey all that I've commanded you. To love God, yes, what I said to Cal, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said, well, that doesn't mean you should do climate change. Well, why not? And he says, well, because. I said, well, because you don't think we can make a difference? Is it because you don't believe the Bible calls us to this? What is it? Well, in effect, people are saying we don't do this because we've never done it before. Well, that's not a good answer. So in casting the vision, number one, what my challenge as a leader of my movement is to do is to engage them in cognitive liberation. Cognitive liberation. They have to actually believe that they can do something they've never been told they can do, and it's never been preached. No survey ever done by the Ellison Research Center, the focus groups I've been a part in or otherwise, has ever shown one evangelical in one church has heard one sermon on this subject. Do you believe that? That's what the survey, that's what the focus groups show. I've been in them. There never has been there one person. Now, stewardship, sermons on money, all the time. Believe me. On the care of creation, beginning in Genesis 1 to exercise dominion, in Genesis 2 to then show care and concern for the earth, all the way to Revelation 11:18 that says God will judge those and he will destroy those who destroy the earth. Not one sermon. I have been in no less than 15 campuses, from Bard to Harvard to Yale to Evangelical College in Springfield, Missouri, all the way to Lancaster Bible College last week. I asked the students how many of them have ever had a sermon, and you can, in audiences anywhere from 800 to 3,000, you get a half dozen hands. Now, I'm telling you, you have to cast a vision that's pretty good if these people are going to follow you. And the reason it's simple is because it's right in the Word of God. And yet it's never been preached. And it's never been taught. And so what is the strategy? It's real simple. It is to take the leaders who have signed a statement in the Evangelical Climate Initiative in 2004, and before that a commitment to discipleship on this subject. In other words, 100 leaders have signed the Evangelical Climate Initiative saying we're going to not only make it a matter of discipleship, but we're going to teach and preach, and we are going to move Congress to act. And that is, frankly, a strategy that was employed on the human rights issues, the Statement of Conscience by the NAE on human rights in 1996, again in 2002 on North Korea and Sudan, and again on this subject of the Evangelical Climate Initiative. It is saying we can do this. We cast a vision. You may have to go into new land like Abraham, leave behind your friends and others to do this, but you are going to be a blessing if you do that. So you cast the vision. Secondly, you help solve problems. And I say on this issue, we evangelicals have made a big, big change. It's not just you see that the NAE surveyed, I asked him to do it, John Green in 1990, the NAE leaders in 1990 said that, well, we, in that year, you see 75%, we changed the world by one person, one soul at a time, have changed so that in the year 2000, 75% of evangelicals, after 10 years, 75% of evangelicals say you change not just one soul at a time, but you change the structures of society. Sounds like liberals, doesn't it? You change the structures of society. The strategy, you see, is to then hold government, leaders, and everybody accountable. That's what we had to do on all these other issues of IRFA bill and everything else. Trafficking, you have to hold leaders here and abroad accountable. Now, here's what I say as a story. Jesus says to Pilate, who says, I can release you or crucify you. And Jesus says back to him, you have no authority except it be given you from above. And here's what is going on. We have leaders who have never been held accountable on these issues because the issues have been perceived as green, they've been perceived as environmental, they've been perceived as Democrat, blue state, and all the rest, and we are saying these are moral issues and we're going to hold the president accountable and the Congress accountable. And we are not going to allow on the biggest issue of the 21st century, in my opinion, climate change and the environment, to allow leaders to not act. And frankly, the reason you have to couch it in moral and theological terms is because it is that. It is that. You can solve water problems here and abroad with actions to solve clean water, but you cannot solve the climate change problem unless you begin to answer even questions about what is all about. These are not just theological problems, they are transcendent problems, they're even cosmological problems. They are that big that raise questions of who is man and who is God, and you have to answer these in moral terms. And when we came out as a movement, that's not just the evangelicals I'm talking about, but all the leaders from a 2005 meeting in Aspen, 100 evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Catholic, Jews, politicians, including Al Gore, John Kerry, and everybody in between, including, I think, Jim Leach was there. Jim was there. I remember you spoke, Jim. And when we came out of that meeting in Aspen in 2005 and said we're going to talk about these issues in moral terms, then the ground moved. Bill Clinton said in front of the Knesset not too long ago, he said when the evangelicals and others came out and said this is a moral and a spiritual issue, the needle began to move. And yesterday, before the press, Barbara Boxer said it's now the #2 issue according to the general public. How did that happen? How do you move people to action? You cast a vision. You show them that you can solve problems. You give them the data. I had a conversion. I'm finishing up here. But I had a conversion in 2002 at Oxford Climate Change when I looked at the data and I said, I can't believe this. You mean to tell me the data isn't split 50-50? You mean to tell me that this is what is happening to our planet and nobody's doing anything about it? I had a conversion. I had one in 1972 to Christ. I had a second one in 2000. I had a second one in 1992 to a broader agenda, and I had a third one in 2002 to the facts and the science and the importance of addressing climate change and all the other environmental issues that we face. And you have to challenge people, confront them with the facts, yes, and show the facts of children and the rest. But you have to smack dab right in the forest, say, if you do not act and sense this vision and calling, I believe that you're missing God's calling for your life, because when your vision of your life doesn't match God's vision for your life, including that for the church, then you will fail. That is what I say to young people. When your vision doesn't match God's vision for the world or even for the church, you will fail. And I don't want the church to fail in these last issues of the 21st century, because everything is at stake. Everything. You cannot take aid to Africa, as this president has done, and God bless him for doing so, even his $15 billion PEPFAR plan, and then take it all away with climate change. King Mohammed VI of Morocco has put me on a plane and flew me out into the Sahara and said, look at desertification. And I said, thank you, sir. I need to see this. And so do Western leaders, and so do the evangelicals. And so, lastly, yes, there's got to be that legislative hook, Alan. And whether it's carbon tax, whether it's a cap and trade program or whatever it is, the American evangelicals need to understand they can move the needle not just publicly, they can solve the problem with legislative action. And in this case, America has to lead, and we as evangelicals will lead this. It is the new, as Tom Friedman has written in the New York Times Magazine this last week, it is the new red, white, and blue. This generation, if you're young here, if you are not the greenest generation, then you will not be the greatest generation. That is what everyone in this room has to be. Lastly, there are people who are going to try and attack you. And they've attacked me. And I simply say your tactics are really important. The tactics have to match the strategy. The tactics are to be like Daniel and Joseph. Cast Daniel in the lion's den, you see, who faced King Darius, who had to choose, frankly. I'll close with this. King Darius in the 6th century BC had to choose between the man or the empire. Save his friend Daniel and sacrifice the empire, or save the empire and sacrifice his friend Daniel. And the late Paul Henry, the son of the famed evangelical theologian Carl F. Henry, used to say as a member of Congress before he got a tumor and died, Paul Henry from Grand Rapids used to say, politicians have to make that choice. And right now today, I'm sorry to say, but this president and this administration have been choosing for their friends and not for the empire. Now that's preaching. But that's the truth. But that is the truth. And we have to say what is the truth and use tactics. When people want to challenge us on the facts, fine. We will debate the facts. But what they really want to do is take away even your opportunity to say it. And that is the debate going on in American evangelicalism. And the leaders of the NAE have stood up and said, at its most recent board meeting in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we will stick to the broad agenda, and not only will we stick to the broad agenda, but here is a document, an evangelical statement against torture. Lastly, wouldn't it be in the height of irony that the God of the universe would do the following? If climate change has been the fallout from the origins debate that has been creation or evolution, the fallout of the origins debate has been that climate change has not seen action in our community of 100 million people. Wouldn't it be ironic if a new coalition talking about bridging divides, talk about Putnam's, building bridges together. Wouldn't it be amazing if the creation crowd joined with the evolution crowd to solve a problem that every one of us faces? That would truly be God's sense of humor. And when you have E.O. Wilson writing, as he did in his book, Creation, that these two worlds, religion and science, have to do this together. You see the beginning of it, and we held our first theologians and scientists meeting at Malhana Plantation in December, press conference in January, and we're traveling now around the world to the hot spots. Eric Chivian at the Harvard Center for, I'm sorry, did I mention Harvard here? Is leading with us at taking famed scientists such as Rita Caldwell from the University of Maryland, Jim McCarthy, the new head of AAAS, and others together with evangelicals to point these things out and to challenge our leaders to solve them. So there is in our responsibility. It's not my responsibility alone, it's your responsibility. We have to do this together with a vision, strategy, and tactics that work. And I will quote George Bush back to himself in his book. Comes from John Wesley in closing. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care as in thy sight to live. And oh, thy servant lead, prepare an account to give. Thank you very much.
Well, my guess is that there won't be any questions, so we can just go. I saw a hand up there first. Yes, you. Oh, I'm sorry. Do wait for the microphone so we can have it recorded.
All right. Thank you, all of you, for your three superb presentations. My question goes out generally to the panel, and any of you should please feel free to answer it. It is in respect of the parallels that have been drawn between evangelical faith here in the United States and a proclivity towards international giving. What, if any, is the extent to which evangelicals in the United States are troubled by the response of a few provincial governments in India to the evangelical movement, to the extent that they've even prohibited conversions to Christianity? Is that a public relations issue that's considered serious by the evangelical movement here? Because to paraphrase these governments and their leaders crudely, what poor people in some districts in India are expected to do is essentially exchange their souls so as to gain access to the medicines and the education and a lot of the other good works that the evangelicals do. So to what extent is that a problem? Thank you.
I can't give you all the details, but the NAE released statements of conscience in 96, 2002, and the next one will be this fall in 2007. It's already been written and addresses this issue. And it specifically is aimed at bringing to attention in the West the plight of the Dalits. And we understand this is very sensitive. We understand that we have to do this in a diplomatic way that doesn't cause negative externalities, unintended consequences. But we have this in our minds. And in fact, we are using the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the end of the slave trade, British slave trade, to draw attention to that issue. Does that answer your question? You're welcome.
Yes, in the back of the blue shirt.
I'd like to thank you also for coming today. I'm a secular humanist liberal, and thank you for coming to this den of secular humanist liberals. Because I thank you because I have, in the last couple of decades, become very close to thinking that evangelicals had horns and tails. And then I started reading Nicholas Kristof about the work that evangelicals have been doing in Africa, and hearing the stories that you have told today, which are totally admirable from my perspective. So my question is this. Are secular humanists, liberals, and evangelicals fated domestically ever to be foes? Can we be allies on some of the issues that are of moral importance to me? I suspect we will never agree on abortion and gay rights. But can we agree that the moral issues of poverty, discrimination, obscenely high executive salaries, and growth and differences in income, and very poor health care systems are moral issues that we can unite on politically to make inroads against?
I'll take the first stab at that. I live in both worlds, really. As a public health physician, most of the people in the public health world in this country are liberals, some with faith, some without faith. And coming in leadership position, and as a political appointee, you're seen with some suspect when you start out. One of the most important things for me, both when I was Commissioner of Health for the state of Virginia and then at USAID, was to be very professional in my work. And the bonds are very clear. The common moral mandate to address the health issues of people here in the U.S. as well as international is a very close relationship, so that when I left both of those jobs, I believe very strongly that my staff, who may come from a very different political place than I, respected me very greatly in the work that we did together, and we were not foes. Now, were there some divisive issues? Yes, we talked a little earlier about some of the political infighting on family planning and abstinence, be faithful condoms, but most of those political wars were outside in the political rhetoric media realm, and that at least on the ground daily working, there was a lot of common ground. And I think that many of the moral issues that we need to be addressing, there's lots of room to be doing it together across the political and religious spectrum.
Let me offer a story that I think illustrates the way in which secular humanists and religionists can in fact work together. When the movement that I describe first began to raise the issue of religious persecution, some of the secular human rights groups were kind of chary of that. And in some ways, some of the religionists were critical of the secular human rights groups for sliding or ignoring religious freedom as a concern. But over time, trust was developed, and relationships were developed, so that by 2004, 2006, Human Rights Watch, a very secular organization, worked closely with the religious community on legislation to combat prison rape in the United States. And Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship worked hand in hand with Ted Kennedy's office to get that bill passed. And that's the kind of thing I think that you can see.
There's a question over here.
I'm Diane Lavoie. I'm not going to couch this as a question, but rather to invite you to think with me about thoughts that have been going through my head from the very first moment of this very excellent panel. And that's when Alan Hertzke, your first statement was stated as a historical statement, and then you went on to describe it, and I've been pondering some of those issues ever since. You indicated that beginning in the 1990s, a human rights movement began that, and then you characterized it and talked about it's drawing its energies from the evangelical movement and from faith, and you've described that eloquently, as did all of you on the panel. I'm speaking kind of running all of your reasons, all of your analysis back through a little bit earlier period of history that I lived through. Right before I came to the Woodrow Wilson School to do the MPA program, I came in 1974. Right before that, I'd had the privilege of launching a human rights organization that was backed by many churches. It's called Washington Office in Latin America, and it it was one piece of a movement that represented many of the U.S. Catholic Conference, Methodist, Presbyterians, and Lutherans, and various others. And at that time, I think the things that are going through my mind as questions are, yes, the points that you made seem to be true then in some respects. Yes, what motivated us and got those churches working was that global Christianity, because we did know, or we knew people, or we were getting, no, there was no email in those days, but we were getting letters, postage stamps on them, that came from mission churches and so on. So I was asking myself, well, why didn't we have among us at that time evangelicals? What were the stumbling blocks, maybe in my mind, I asked myself, what were the stumbling blocks that were keeping other churches from being with us at that time? And then I had to, as the panel went on, I had to get more honest with myself and say, what were the stumbling blocks, or what are the stumbling blocks that have kept some of the faith traditions of which I've been a part, the Quakers, the Presbyterians, and so on, from being part of the movement? For example, most recently you mentioned religious freedom, and various other movements since then. And what I've been playing with is the previous panel, and my mind is running back to Bob Putman and the issues of identity and networking, kind of, and wondering really what is it that has us at different points, why is it that our identity may actually keep us from doing things? And specifically, I was thinking of our identity as religious people vis-a-vis the state. Some of our churches literally would have a flag from our church next to the American flag. For other of our churches, that would have been an abomination, just to take a symbol kind of thing. So I think I'm just running through my mind the issue of identity and how that has been either an aid or a stumbling block to our working together on these issues. And of course, I'm looking at this all as someone who is passionate also about global climate change and the issues you raise.
Anne-Marie? Okay. All right.
I'll start. I'll take a stab at that. Religious identity has been a stumbling block in some cases. Some in the mainline community, in fact, when evangelicals were raising the issue of religious freedom, took some umbrage because they'd been involved in human rights work, and they, I think, felt that there were these interlopers on their turf to a certain extent. And some of them tended to downplay the importance of religious persecution, which seemed to be an evangelical issue. And so I think early on there were those stumbling blocks. But over time, I think as relationships were developed, and this goes back to the importance of personal relationships, some of those stumbling blocks, I think, have been minimized and have been reduced. And people are working together more now than they were.
Yeah, I maybe have a slightly different twist on this. I see some of the stumbling blocks in both the reality and the perception of separation of church and state. That as I came into USAID, some of our own staff were thinking we can't work with some faith-based organizations because that would get in the way of church and state. And equivalently, my missionary colleagues, my faith-based organizations who have long been doing service across the world were going, we don't want to work with the U.S. government. They aren't going to let us express our faith orientation. Neither of those things are completely true. There is lots of room to work together. And so I found myself often sitting in my office with my own staff, so public health professionals, with friends from the faith community and mission organizations, and they would be saying exactly the same things, but in different language. And I would be translating back and forth and helping them understand that they actually had the same intent and could, in fact, find ways to be working together. But that takes a lot of negotiation. In some ways, we've moved the world so far apart that there has been a distrust that has come forward. And there is a feeling among some in the Christian world that politics, policy, all of that is something other and not necessarily, it's part of the keep yourself unstained from the world. If you get involved in politics, how do you do that? And so there's been a hesitation to get engaged until we hit some of these really hard issues where the only way you fix them is to begin to deal with global policies, or at least national policies, and that means you have to get engaged in the political debate.
Here's how I would answer it. Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, Anabaptist traditions, they all have political traditions. Evangelicals have an overriding political vision. According to Alan Gelzo, he's defined it as that congregational, anti-liturgical, millennial reign of Jesus Christ conversion towards social reform vision found in pietism that goes all the way back to England. That is the overriding vision according to Alan Gelzo, the Lincoln scholar, of who evangelicals are. Now, in our political history, the important theological distinction was not what denominations did, but what happened between, say, the pietists, who were the parts of the largest part of the first Whig and then the Republican Party, and what the confessionalists or the liturgicals did, who made up the Democratic Party. In other words, that's our American history. There are these, as Alan said, religious identities, and they still pose a problem because the older evangelical leaders have a social gospel versus true gospel split in their heads that say, well, we don't do what the liberals do. The younger evangelicals, it never even occurs to them. And yet there is, because of this historical pietist tradition that you see has lent toward one political party, a liturgical confessionalist toward the other, a split that raises suspicions. And I think we have to really learn how to talk to one another in ways. It's helpful when the mainline Protestant Catholics and others understand that for the average evangelical, and this is a great advantage, but it's also a liability, belief and action are two sides of the same spiritual coin. Belief and action, that's a great benefit. It enables us to come into the political arena with the sense that, hey, we are going to bring our values, but it also is a big ball and chain if you don't know how to do it. And thus, you see, when somebody makes statements in the political arena that seem out of bounds, Alan Brinkley at the American Historical Review, quote, evangelicals are the greatest and we're the greatest problem to modern politics because they won't relegate religion to the private sphere. Well, that's a problem to us. We do relegate religion to the public sphere. We believe, as George Will, that statecraft is soulcraft. We believe that you can redeem the state, not just the person. And so we have to find ways, knowing that history, to bridge the differences, not just with scientists on these issues, but with the mainline Protestant and other Catholic traditions. And yet I believe there is great, great hope because the younger generation doesn't carry a lot of this baggage around, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, you have last word.
This is a comment, not a question, so it'll help for the last word. And it was a wonderful panel. I should just say I have a book coming out in 3 weeks on the idea that as America, keeping faith with our values in a dangerous world. The title's carefully chosen, and the chapter on climate change is actually drawn from your text from Micah based on humility, and humility as a key part of faith. And it is humility in the face of the greater forces of nature or God, however you want to see them, that I think demands that we focus on climate change. But I want to end in the spirit of bridge building, because I was very struck with Ann Peterson's answer to Basil. You said, he described himself as a secular humanist, and you said, well, I work with many political liberals who do not have faith. That's not, I think, quite right. I'm closer probably to where Bays is. Everybody has their own beliefs. But I think many, many, many Americans who are not necessarily traditionally religious have great faith. They have great faith in forces larger than ourselves. They have faith in the ability of mankind, humankind, to come together, to make a difference, to save the children, to save the planet, to live our lives in a meaningful way. And that faith may not be grounded in a particular religious tradition, but part of our coming together is for us as a nation and a world to recover a common faith. Thank you.
Here, here.